famous director, probably the most famous filmmaker of the time.
He was a combination of a social director, a great chef, a lion tamer, the man who ran the circus.
Fellini represents this paragon of creativity and fantasy.
His films are all about himself. It's what he knew best. He is considered a superstar.
Silenzio. His name evokes the eccentric and the extravagant, the celebratory and the surreal. Action! Federico Fellini was a director whose style was so distinctive, even those who haven't seen his movies still have an idea of what Fellini-esque means.
Fellini became a trademark name like Ford or Sony. The name suggested that feeling you got, that style from Fellini movies, which is the sacred and the profane, the humorous, the larger than life, the poetic, the funny, all of that wrapped into one Fellini-esque.
Fellini's obsessions were dreams, fantasy, and imagination. He took his audience on a journey through modern and ancient Rome, filled with clowns, carnivals, parades, nuns, priests, and prostitutes. And there were no faces like Fellini's faces.
One of the great things about Fellini's film is they're also funny. Only in Chaplin you are moved to tears and you laugh at the same time. And Fellini is the same.
Fellini was a showman whose films were larger than life. I Vitelloni, La Strada, Nights of Cabiria, La Dolce Vita, 8½. His movies influenced just about every serious film director in the world.
He's a great influence. It's a kind of filmmaking that's very personal. Most of the directors I know, talk about Fellini to them, the hat goes off.
His work was a complete and total research of the mystery of life. He wanted to understand through religion, through magic sometimes, why we do exist.
Fellini's extravagance on the screen was matched by his working style behind the scenes.
He was sort of like a combination of a social director, a maitre d', a great chef, a lion tamer, the man who ran the circus.
He had exactly in mind what he wanted. He was the only artist on the film, on the set. All the rest were like colors for his fresco.
While he was directing, he was never silent. He used to sort of guide the actors all through the scene because he kept talking. That's why he had to dub all his films.
E amava profondamente.
He loved to act out all the roles of the actors. In fact, the beauty was such, the entertainment was such, that all the roles, all the dialogue, all facial expressions, or looks, or movements, were first performed by him.
You see him treating people like puppets, literally moving the head of the extras or even of the big actors. Say, do this, move 2 inches left, 3 inches right.
In many cases, the actors are counting numbers. He tells them, well, you can't act, he wants you for your face, so just sit there and count from 1 to 10 and keep counting and I'll worry about what you say later.
When he was shooting, he was different. He could become extremely impatient. He got angry easily. He would shout and yell at the actors.
In fact, Fellini's approach to acting was very much a lion tamer, breaking in the lion. A ringmaster who has to tame the wild beasts so that they do exactly what he wants from them.
They would be crying in their dressing rooms and he wouldn't remember. He would say, why? Why are they upset? What did I do?
The films of Federico Fellini borrowed from his own life, including his childhood growing up in Italy. But Fellini was loose with the facts.
He could absolutely not be trusted with details of his life. He believed in his lies, and he was such an incredible storyteller It's impossible to tell what was true, what was made up.
This much is certain. Federico Fellini was born on January 20th, 1920, in Rimini, Italy, a small town on the rocky coast of the Adriatic Sea. During the summer months, Rimini was a resort where Italian families and tourists could swim and sun on the beach. Rimini also drew rich foreign tourists to its Grand Hotel.
The Grand Hotel is like the old lady of the city. It's the only noble, grand place in the city. Of course, for a young boy or young girl who lives there, is the unreachable fairy tale kind of place that you can enter only if you are a noble or you're ultra rich.
Federico's father, Urbano, was a successful food merchant who traveled throughout the country selling olive oil, wine, Parmesan cheese, and prosciutto.
He turned it into a very successful business. He was firmly middle class in that sense, but he was also a ladies' man, charismatic like Fellini, very much the absent father.
The Fellini father was not a faithful husband, as indeed the Federico Fellini himself wasn't. And his father always brought gifts for the mother. And she felt that she could tell by the size of the gift how unfaithful her husband had been to her.
His mother, Ida, was often left alone to raise her 3 children, Federico, his brother Riccardo, and their sister Maria Maddalena.
She came from a very strict Catholic household. That's one of the reasons why Fellini rebelled against his upbringing. In fact, it was stifling, suffocating. It was important to keep up appearances. The social mask was absolutely essential to her.
The more Ida and Urbano became estranged from each other, the more their distance permeated the home and their relationship with Federico.
He tended to be kind of a loner. He wasn't, it wasn't the sort of gregarious character that we think about later. Played a lot by himself, sort of used his imagination, did a lot of drawing.
He was very gifted at drawing. In school, he was making all the caricatures of the professors and became very popular. Then at the Folger Movie House in Rimini, where he was a customer, someone commissioned him to do the caricatures of American divas, which were then used for advertising.
Federico attended Catholic grade school, where stern priests taught obedience and piety through prayer.
It was very repressive, his education, the school, the Catholic Church. He used to say that for a creative person, this is good, because all your creativity is just dying to burst out. So the more you repress it, the more it will explode.
Another repressive force for Fellini was fascism. Italy at the time was under the rule of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who ruled the country for more than 20 years and created his own legend of Il Duce. Each Saturday, Fellini wore the uniform of the Italian fascist youth and marched around Rimini's town square.
He was a natural opponent. He was the one during the course of fascism, during the years of fascism when he was in school. He was unruly. He broke with all the rights of the regime, rights of the church, familiar rights of the bourgeois. He was a real anarchist.
During the drills, Fellini's mind was probably elsewhere. As a child, the young Fellini was known for his unusual imagination. He spent hours designing and playing with a tiny puppet theater. He loved comic strips, most of all, Little Nemo, a comic strip about a boy whose dreams at night are wild and fantastical trips of his imagination, like Federico's. When he was 7, Federico went to his first circus. He was fascinated by the clowns, both shocked and attracted.
And at first he was a bit frightened by it all. But then he told the story for years how he ran away and joined the circus. Actually, it was an afternoon. But during that afternoon, he had the opportunity to wash a zebra. And that remained one of the great tactile things of his life, a memory of how it feels to wash a wet zebra.
he could also escape at the Fulgor Cinema, where he liked to watch American movies, especially comedies, like the Marx Brothers and Charlie Chaplin. But Fellini longed for real freedom from Rimini, from the church, the government, and his mother's watchful eye. And the place he really wanted to be was Rome. In 1938, Fellini left his home and family for Rome, where he found work on a newspaper. The job got him out and about in the city.
When he got to Rome, he simply met people, and he was very assiduous about visiting people, about meeting people. He was very good at that, and he was very charming.
He caught the attention of several editors with his caricatures and cartoons. By 1939, Fellini was working in Rome for a renowned Italian humor magazine called Marco Aurelio. But it wasn't all funny. In 1940, Mussolini joined forces with Hitler during World War II. Federico had no interest in serving his country, so he tried getting a medical deferment to avoid the draft. He claims to have bribed doctors and made up rare illnesses. He also told myriad stories about avoiding the draft, like the one about his medical records being bombed just as he was about to be examined for a medical deferment. The staff of Marco Aurelio was filled with writers whose contribution to Italian cinema would soon become legendary.
That world of vaudeville and variety theaters is very much a part of that. I mean, these same people that Marcus Aurelius at this journal would also write sketches and write radio programs, and they also scripted films. And so once you're in that environment, you could almost do 5 or 6 different things.
Soon, Fellini was writing for radio. In June 1943, Fellini wrote a series about newlyweds called Chico and Polina. A 22-year-old acting student named Giulietta Messina won the part of Polina and the heart of Fellini.
And he heard her voice on the radio, and he called her, and he said he had to have dinner with her.
Since Fellini looked like an artist, a bohemian, at the restaurant she thought, who knows what the cost will be? Who knows if he will have enough money to pay? There was this doubt. And at the end, he took out a bundle of 1,000 lira bills and paid casually.
It's a question almost of love at first sight, but it's also a question of telepathy at first sight. Both of them were very interested in parapsychology, in magic, in alchemy, in astral projection. And there was a sort of meeting of minds over that fancy dinner.
Federico saw Giulietta as his muse. One of the things he liked was the reflection of himself that he saw in her eyes. Giulietta absolutely worshipped him, and she worshipped him from the day she met him until the day he died. He was the love of her life, and actually she was the love of his.
Federico and Giulietta were married on October 30th, 1943. Eager to be a mother, Messina became pregnant soon after her marriage, and in 1944 gave birth to a son, Pierre Federico. He died shortly after birth. It was a traumatic shock for both of them.
He and Giulietta never talked about the death of their child, baby Federico, because if they did, he felt it would make it more real, and that they could never escape the feeling of sadness.
Federico non è mai cresciuto, che è rimasto un figlio, non è mai diventato un padre.
Federico never grew up. He remained the son. He never became the father. If he had seen this son grow up at home, his personality would have developed otherwise. This was something very painful and very crucial in their lives.
In June 1944, the Americans occupied Rome. Fellini opened a small store called the Funny Face Shop, where he drew caricatures of American GIs. One day, in walked the director Roberto Rossellini. Rossellini wanted Fellini to help him write a screenplay he was working on. The movie was Rome, Open City, about a priest who bravely defies the fascist regime. Rome, Open City became a classic of Italian cinema. Even today, the death scene of Pina, machine-gunned down in front of her young son as she tries to stop the arrest of her fiancé, remains one of the most highly charged in movie history.
Francesco! 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 Francesco!
Rome Open City was an immediate success abroad and launched the careers of both Rossellini and Fellini. It gave birth to a new cinematic film style called neo-realism, which favored natural lighting, real people over actors, and oftentimes a political message.
Neorealism is born out of the urgency of war that had a certain political message. And Fellini wasn't really keen on that. He was a very astute observer of society and politics, but he didn't want to make films with a message.
Even so, for many years, Fellini worked as a scriptwriter with Rossellini and other neo-realists, helping to write dozens of films, including some classics. It was during the production of one movie that Fellini wandered into the editing room and observed how Italian films were made. Fellini saw that there was no sound, only the image. The dialogue would be dubbed in later. Fellini had something of an epiphany. He realized he wanted to direct. His first solo film was The White Sheik, a comic strip-inspired farce whose mix of reality and fantasy, of bleak humor and bittersweet romance, would become Fellini trademarks.
Fellini was rather worried about taking on such an enormous task. The first day of shooting, he promptly forgot exactly what the scene entailed, but nonetheless realized that he had to bluff his way through. And he did it to such a successful extent that there was a sense of authority that took over this very shy, poetic young man.
This was the origin of that confusion, that orderly confusion, which was the world where Fellini's things were created. And this is how he became a director, from one day to the next.
Unfortunately, The White Sheik failed to register at the box office, and Federico Fellini was about to slip into obscurity. In 1952, Federico Fellini's first crack at solo directing had failed at the box office, and he was about to fail too. Then, Fellini made I Vitelloni, a partly autobiographical film set in a small Italian town like Rimini, about 5 friends who had nothing to do.
Vitelloni means the fatted calves. They had no jobs. They just would walk around holding arm in arm, walk through the town of Rimini, where Federico was from, and play pool and look at girls and smoke and talk about their dreams. The picture made me shudder. I felt I knew them, and I'm from Brooklyn.
Fellini, of course, wasn't a Vitelloni himself, just the opposite. He had left Rimini for Rome, but he did create a character like himself among the Vitelloni, Moraldo.
You'll notice that he's the least slacker of the 5. I mean, he's the one that's the most serious. He's the one that doubts the rightness of how they operate, how they do certain things. That he's sort of the conscience of the groups.
Moraldo was so much a part of Fellini that when the character leaves for Rome, it's actually Fellini saying goodbye.
Federico told the actor, "Look, I'll say this myself, and if you listen carefully, you can hear the last words of the film are spoken by Federico."
Ciao, Moraldo! Ciao! Addio! Addio, Vito!
I Vitelloni was Fellini's first big success, and it earned him respect as a director. Fellini's next film was a fable about a brutish circus strongman, Zampano, who takes on a dim-witted girl, Gelsomina, to assist him in his act. Fellini cast his wife, Giulietta Messina, in the role of the simpleton, Gelsomina, who is brutalized by Zampano.
She has this wonderful expressive face that she was called immediately the female Charlie Chaplin. And she was a natural clown. Just a few simple eyelashes, with a little bit of dark crayon, and all of a sudden she has a sort of different aspect.
In La Strada, Fellini used his Catholic upbringing to explore the idea of salvation and redemption.
Fellini takes a metaphor, which is that of conversion or receiving grace, a kind of Catholic metaphor, and uses it for other purposes. He uses it for a very clearly secular purpose. He uses it as a metaphor for changing one's life.
Fellini may have been trying to change his own life. During the filming of La Strada, he was going through a personal crisis.
The production of La Strada was an extremely difficult one. Fellini was crippled by self-doubt and by depression before and after the shooting of La Strada. In the beginning, he sought a Freudian psychoanalysis, especially in the 50s, because he had a number of very severe bouts with depression and flirted with suicide several times.
Andò in crisi sulla lavorazione della strada.
He experienced a crisis while working on La Strada. La Strada perhaps was a film telling something very personal, very intimate about Federico. He later told me that he was filming one of the last scenes and felt as if someone had turned off the light. He said, "I felt thrown in the dark and anxious." Somehow he found his way back to the hotel, went to bed, and no longer wanted to get up.
Dice che in qualche modo ha recuperato l'albergo, si è messo a letto così e non voleva più alzarsi.
His marriage, metaphorically, was not very different from La Strada. He was Zampano and Giulietta was Gelsomina. Of course, a genial artistic version of Zampano.
La Strada is all about the rapport between people and the difficulty in having that rapport, the very great difficulty in making the connection with another person.
His films are all about himself. It's what he knew best. He was an expert on himself.
Despite Fellini's crisis of confidence, La Strada was a worldwide success. Its haunting theme song by Nino Rota became a hit, and Rota's music became synonymous with Fellini's style.
L'atmosfera dei film di Fellini è indisgiungibile dalla musica di Rota.
The atmosphere of a film by Fellini is inseparable from Rota's music. Inseparable. Nino Rota composed the music for Fellini's films often in a state of somnambulism, in a trance, so that Federico liked to tell that when he called Nino to screen first cut of the film to see what music to put in, Nino fell asleep. Then he woke up at the end when Federico told him, "But Nino, didn't you follow anything?" No, I followed. I understood everything." He had understood everything truly, and the music was exactly what was good for the film.
E la musica era esattamente quella che serviva per il film.
La Strada won the Silver Lion at the Venice Festival in 1954 and earned Fellini an Oscar for Best Foreign Film in 1956.
When it went on to win an Oscar, it wasn't a question that the success went to his head. It was a question that confirmed all that he had hoped to achieve in cinema. It gave him confidence in himself.
The success of La Strada in 1954 established Federico Fellini as an international star. Fellini and his wife, Giulietta Messina, worked together again in Nights of Cabiria. Once again, Messina won rave reviews and was awarded Best Actress at the Cannes Film Festival. Nights of Cabiria earned Fellini his second Best Foreign Film Oscar.
Oramai Fellini era diventato un amicone di tutti gli italiani.
By this time, Fellini had become the great friend of the Italians, of all the Romans. They knew him, and he was a merit to all of us. Long live Fellini. The film was absolutely wonderful, and hence, everything went well.
By 1960, Fellini had had three big successes: I Vitelloni, La Strada, and Nights of Cabiria. But nothing would compare to the fame he would find with his next movie, La Dolce Vita. Federico Fellini was already an established director in Italy when his 1960 film La Dolce Vita catapulted him to international stardom. In La Dolce Vita, the world saw the emergence of Fellini's distinctive imprint, the Baroque, theatrical, and gallant stylist.
It's a grander vision, you know, starting with the helicopter and the plaster Jesus flying over Rome. I mean, that's a big shot.
La Dolce Vita presented a decadent and corrupt society where morals were loose, freedom unlimited, and sin a thing of the past. La Dolce Vita follows the journey of Marcello Rubini, a young writer for the gossip tabloids, on a kaleidoscopic journey through Roman nightlife. Marcello, played by Marcello Mastroianni, is a man on the brink of moral decay and despair.
And he enjoys too much in a very morbid, soft, too soft way. It's a very tough and somehow depressing look at this spoiled society. But superficially, this is the film that launched the image of La Dolce Vita, of this glamorous 60s Italy.
And no scene was more glamorous than the moment Marcello steps into the ancient Trevi fountain with the American actress played by Anita Ekberg.
There was a lot of buzz and excitement about it, although audiences flocked to it because they heard it was a sexy movie.
There is an orgy, which at the time was a total scandal. Now it's almost ridiculous, but at the time was extremely, extremely explicit.
The movie was considered so shocking and scandalous, it was condemned by the Catholic Church. But La Dolce Vita won the Grand Jury Prize at Cannes, broke records at the box office worldwide, and had an enormous impact upon Italian and international popular culture. The film marked the first collaboration between Fellini and actor Marcello Mastroianni. Mastroianni would become identified as Fellini's alter ego. All the temptations facing Marcello in La Dolce Vita were echoes of Fellini's own.
Marcello Rubini, played by Marcello Mastroianni, is infused with Fellini's aspirations and disappointments. Fellini wanted to portray a kind of pilgrimage, but a downward spiral, a downward pilgrimage, as it were, a spiritual degeneration, precisely because the hero himself can't find anything to believe in. That's precisely Fellini's problem.
La Dolce Vita, I believe, is what Fellini fears at the time. I came from a small town, I'm successful in the big town, I might be lost, morally lost.
In a way, Fellini was lost. After the stunning success of La Dolce Vita, he suffered a devastating creative block.
Fellini was experiencing a big crisis. He was the famous director, probably the most famous filmmaker of the time, and he didn't know what to say.
And after all, he's just made the most successful film in European film history in terms of box office. Now what does he do? I mean, how do you follow that?
There's a definite creative block because he's spiritually blocked. We're dealing with a very troubled man, complex personality, and perhaps to a certain extent, although it hasn't been assessed clinically, he was bipolar, manic depressive.
After struggling for weeks, Fellini had the sudden inspiration to tell his own story.
He turned inward, if you will, and he talked about himself. And actually it was a stroke of genius because he produced what I consider the greatest Italian film ever made, and maybe the greatest film ever made.
That film is 8½, so named for Fellini's 8½" production. 8½" is the story of Fellini's creative crisis, his struggles with his producers, the press, his relations with his mistress, and his estrangement from his wife. Once again, Marcello Mastroianni was Fellini's alter ego, and this time, Mastroianni even looked like him, wearing Fellini's signature black Stetson hat and black suit throughout the movie.
What you see in the film is exactly what was happening. He didn't know what to do with his films. He didn't know what to do with his wife, with his mistress, which, by the way, is the real mistress. We're talking about Sandra Lila.
Delicioso! Incredible! Salaud! Menteur! Je suis venu de Paris. Qual est la mia parte nel film? Ah! La mia parte! Ah! C'est la maman dans le film!
No! But of all of his films, 8½, is the one that's the most magical. Because there is this kind of interweave of dream, fantasy, and reality in the life of this blocked movie director. You know, this guy who wants to make his gigantic statement. It's about Fellini in a kind of profound way.
8½'s elaborate structure, numerous sequences, and characters reflect the complexity of the inner workings of Fellini's mind. The result is a storyline that jumps quickly from the real world to fantasies to memories of his childhood.
Reality in 8½, is always in quotations. Fantasy, dreams, wish fulfillment, memory, they're all mixed up in 8½. One minute you're in Guido's mind, the next minute you're supposedly outside it, the next minute you're in a fantasy of his childhood, the next minute you're in something he's daydreaming about.
You don't know where reality is stopping and the dream is beginning. There's no signal to you. There's no visual signal that says, okay, now we're in a dream. You say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Oh, he must be dreaming, you say a couple minutes later.
By the end of 8½, Fellini, as Guido, has resolved his artistic crisis.
He's out on his set that's kind of empty. He says, it's over, forget it, I'm not going to do it. You know, no matter what they say to me, I can't do it. And these figures start appearing. And they really are saying to him, come on, boss, let's make a film.
8½, won top honors from Italian film critics and earned Fellini his third Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. The film remains Fellini's masterpiece.
It's not by accident that so many other directors have imitated 8½, and so many people have studied it, and so many people have written on it, and so many people, it's become kind of a canonical work in film departments, I'm sure.
There's a sort of euphoria after 8½. You have to think about the huge international success of La Dolce Vita in 1960. You follow that by, once again, a huge international success with 8½. He is considered a superstar.
But Fellini's style would change, becoming more and more flamboyant and exaggerated as he began using his dreams as the inspiration for his art. After going through a number of personal and creative crises, Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini, under the influence of a Jungian analyst, began recording his dreams, filling large notebooks with colorful sketches that would become a source of inspiration for his art. His next film, Juliet of the Spirits, filled with seances, dreams, fantasies, and encounters with the supernatural, reflects the growing influence dreams and psychoanalysis were having upon Fellini. Juliet of the Spirits starred Fellini's wife, Giulietta Messina, and the story of Juliet, a woman living in the shadow of her cheating husband, paralleled Giulietta's.
I'm sure she knew that there were not only friendships, but other things as well, other affairs. But I think she could tell that she had a very important role in his life, and then she knew that she couldn't be a traditional wife with such an artistic, creative person. So she let him absolutely free.
Non esiste, lui non si sarebbe mai divorziato.
He would have never gotten divorced. The affairs were all very insignificant, very superficial. He was a dreamer of sex. He wasn't someone who went out for the hunt. He couldn't be without her, but not because she was his woman. She was his everything, his heart, his protection, his everything.
La sua protezione era tutto.
But in one area, Giulietta did insist on control: money. La Dolce Vita was Federico Fellini's greatest commercial success and made a lot of money, but not for Fellini. He had given up his percentage of the profits so that he could build a replica of Via Veneto.
Non avrebbe fatto nemmeno I film senza Giulietta, è stato il suo.
He wouldn't have even done the films without Giulietta. She was his support, his crutch. She was the one who resolved everything, took care of all the money that he earned. And he earned little because he was not good with anything related to money or the producers. Giulietta would get it. He never had anything in his pockets. He walked around without any money.
E lui era sempre senza una lira in tasca, camminava senza soldi.
Fellini was a bona fide artist in that sense. He didn't have a sense of money, a business sense. He was a spendthrift. And Giulietta Messina, at one point, had his bank account blocked. And what she would do was give him pocket money for the day. Fellini went along with that because he realized that it was the only way to keep him from going bankrupt.
After Juliet of the Spirits, Fellini intended next to film The Journey of G. Mastorna, the story of a musician in a plane crash who comes to realize he has died.
And Fellini decides he's going to write a script where he follows him into the afterlife. And you're dealing, of course, with a very superstitious man, going into the afterlife, dealing with death in such a direct way, probably frightened him to a certain extent.
He was scared by the film, because it's about death. And Fellini was convinced that making that film would mean to die.
But on the back lots of Cinecittà, the producer Dino De Laurentiis had already invested in an enormous set for the opening sequence.
The tension is so great that Fellini actually succumbs to a heart attack. He's rushed to the hospital and he's diagnosed with a very rare disease, Sanarelli-Schwarzman syndrome. It's a disease that only occurs in animals. And he survives only because a friend from Rimini, a veterinarian, shows up on the scene and diagnoses the allergy correctly.
Every once in a while, when he didn't have ideas, he used to wonder if he should start working on that film again. But then his fears were stronger, and he would say, no, I can't make that film. And so it was always there, but never made.
Subsequent films continued the rich, flamboyant imagery that became a Fellini trademark. His next film, Satyricon, was a visual extravaganza of lush, Baroque imagery based on an ancient Roman work. It was a major hit in the psychedelic era. With each new film, the images became more surreal, the storylines less significant, and the reviews more critical.
Fellini probably had too much creative freedom after 8½. It's Fellini riding the wave of his extraordinary success at that time and refusing to listen to criticism. In fact, on the set of Juliet of the Spirits, he has terrible rows with his creative team, a team that brought him to his international success. It's almost as if Fellini were saying that what matters most is my own imagination and the primacy of the image.
What he thinks film is about images and about the way things look, not the way people speak. And so he privileges the way the actor looks, and many of his actors are picked solely because of their face.
A lui piaceva molto il falso, diciamo.
He liked falseness very much, but a falseness that was an absolute truth, not a lie. If he didn't construct his images, his scenes, I don't believe he'd have felt satisfied.
Fellini's vision became more and more Baroque, more and more visionary, and richer. And in a sense, in the weakest moment, you have the impression that Fellini was an imitator of Fellini, but only in the weakest moment.
In 1973, Fellini completed the last of his works to reach a wide commercial audience, Amarcord. It was a nostalgic and satirical look at his own adolescence in Rimini during the fascist era. Amarcord also took on Fellini's Catholic education.
E allora doveva andare contro.
He had to fight it. He also had to commit a sin with his images. So he had the boy with the tobacconist's breasts in Amarcord, and this boy was drowning in the breasts of this huge tobacconist.
Dentro le tette di questa tabaccaia grosse così.
Stia fuori. Perché me lei di no?
Ed era una...
It was his rebellion against his Catholic education.
Amarcord was not only a commercial success, but earned Fellini his 4th Oscar for Best Foreign Film. Fellini made several more movies, including Fellini's Casanova, City of Women, and The Ship Sails On and Ginger and Fred, starring one final time Marcello Mastroianni and Giulietta Messina. But none of them found the kind of critical acclaim that his earlier films had achieved. His final feature film, Voices of the Moon, starring Roberto Benigni, never even made it to America for distribution. Fellini couldn't get backing to make another movie and fell into a depression.
Producers were no longer willing to produce Fellini's films, especially after the flop of his very last film, The Voice of the Moon. There was no producer in Rome who was willing to take a gamble on a new Fellini venture.
The remainder of Fellini's life would be the most difficult of his career. Although he was a legendary director, his films had not done well at the box office for some time.
He was an artist. He was a real artist, and so probably like all artists, he had this urge to express himself. And of course, making movies was his expression. The problem is that for a painter or a writer, you can just take pen and paper and write or just paint a picture, but he needed a lot of money.
Fellini was very unhappy in the last stages of his life. He had heart problems. He was suffering from arteriosclerosis, or clogged arteries.
He was half paralyzed, but he had arranged for himself a small painter studio. He knew that he could no longer direct a film, but could go there and paint. And he painted all day.
In 1991, Fellini shot 3 brief advertising spots for the Bank of Rome. They were his final creations on film. In 1993, Fellini traveled to Hollywood to receive his 5th Oscar, this one for a lifetime of work. The moment when he said to his wife, "Stop crying, Giulietta," was one of the most memorable of Oscar history.
The way he talked to Giulietta and say, "Stop crying, Giulietta." And you understand that there was a bond, there was a strong liaison that overwhelmed and surpassed any kind of betrayal or accidents or fight that happened.
Just 5 months later, on August 3rd, Fellini suffered a stroke while staying at the Grand Hotel in Rimini. Federico Fellini died in Rome on October 31st, 1993. His funeral service was held in a Roman basilica, and a huge crowd flowed into the piazza outside. The coffin was then taken back to his hometown of Rimini. Fellini died just days after the 50th anniversary of his marriage to Giulietta Messina. Just 6 months later, Messina died too. But Fellini's influence will never die. His particular style has been seen in movies as diverse as Bob Fosse's All That Jazz, Woody Allen's Stardust Memories, and Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull, whose Jake LaMotta was a kind of American Zampano.
What Fellini represents, certainly to other directors, is this paragon of creativity and fantasy. But I think people like Martin Scorsese and the generation of filmmakers that Scorsese represents saw Fellini as a kind of example that you could be yourself, you could express yourself individually, you could be creative, and yet you could also be commercial.
Fellini is one of the greatest artists, not only in filmmaking, one of the greatest artists of 20th century. He's the most Italian among the Italian filmmakers, and at the same time the most universal.
I hope the people who see this see the Fellini films, because they will tell you more about him than anybody can tell you about him. See his movies. That's Federico Fellini.